Hey everyone, it's Jamie, and this week I'm the discussion leader for Chapter 2 of Tetschalt's Myth of Seneca Falls. Chapter 2 analyzes the change of the suffrage movement post-war and examines why Seneca Falls became the new focus of the origin story for the movement. The post-suffrage movement was splintered by the increase of the number of women who joined with vastly different advocacy styles, motivations, experiences, etc. And such differences and lack of unity ultimately threatened to dismantle and overshadow the original legacy of the pre-war movement. And the idea of the myth of Seneca Falls emerged a quarter of a century after the actual event to attempt to revitalize and link the movement across localities, state, regions, and the women themselves. After the Civil War, women suffragists were empowered and gained a sense of who they were as public citizens as a result of their work in the Union, or for the Union and its armies. Around 1865, we see a new type of suffrage activism emerge in the form of on-the-ground advocacy. After the war, instead of acting in concert with each other, women began to increasingly work independently. Sometimes they ended up advocating against each other. The fragments of local, state, and regional activists made it nearly impossible to regroup into a unitary national organization. And through the 1860s and 70s, we saw an explosion of activism explode all over the place. Especially in the Midwest. We see the formation of local suffrage societies who hosted their own conventions and tours. However, we can see that these suffrage movements sometimes opposed each other very strongly in terms of espoused values. For example, even within the same state of South Carolina, where a racially integrated convention had taken place, we also saw activists who espoused white supremacist values instead. We also see the emergence of individual women activists who were not tied to specific local, state, regional, or national associations. The suffrage movement, with its rise and expansion, had reached a level of normalcy, or at least pervasiveness, in the setting of society. The frequency of suffrage meetings and conventions raised no serious opposition, as noted by William Lloyd Garrison. It's important to note that this new movement of suffragettes wasn't comprised of new converts who were fresh and new to the existing framework. They were those who had just launched their own organizations, pursued their own targets' agendas, and formed their own solutions. From the new face of feminist activism, we see the emergence of the Lyceum, where women lectured on the suffrage movement. It was a massive departure from the antebellum age, where lectured women were disregarded and oftentimes ridiculed for having the gall to attempt to lecture the omnipotent man. The new lecturing women were commercialized, paid well, promoted the movement, and drew more women into this new type of activism. Although they may have belonged to one, these female lecturers didn't have to work for a suffrage organization. Therefore, there was a great deal of independence, as these lectures were essentially one-woman shows. And these lectures really changed the court of public opinion on the suffrage movement. All different types of people attended these lyceums, and they drew upwards of several thousands to these lectures, and through cross-country tours, reached an assortment variety of people. We see a split starting to form between Anthony and Stanton. In the example of the Lyceum, Anthony was torn by this new form of activism. She lamented the forgotten pain felt by the antebellum lecturers who braved negative general opinion, and she felt that these pre-war lecturers had paved the way for these new generational women to flippantly seek commercial fame and success. But she did acknowledge that these post-war female lecturers were making suffrage known far and wide, which Anthony took as a hesitant sign of success. On the other hand, we have Stanton, who preferred these solo engagements and hated big conventions. Stanton thought that conventions were too rehearsed and that the format was old-fashioned. At lyceums, she could earn money and develop her own thoughts and arguments. She was noted as being a historically unrelenting person, and at conventions, she often took a lot of heat for being so uncompromising about her ideas. The individual work of women who pursued lecturing exerted a decentralizing downward pressure on the existing greater movement. It further pulled women away from the organizational work and made it harder for the suffrage organizations to coordinate and consolidate. Overall, we see issues and disorganizations on the micro and macro levels of the movement. The American Association and the National Association were at odds about where to direct their objectives to. Was it state or national that they needed to go to? On the middle scale, we see state and local societies either splitting away or refusing to affiliate with the national associations. We see suffragists enraged that they were even cited by the national organizations as a result of their not knowing what an auxiliary status is. We also see regional organizations working for and wanting independence from each other, which resulted in the formations of the now four national women's suffrage organization: the Pacific, the Northwest, the American, and the National Associations. And on the micro level, we see rival factions forming within even the same state organization, as highlighted by Illinois. The section about Victoria Woodhull made me laugh a lot. She was so eccentric and shattered every family dynamic norm or gender norm from birth to suffrage. She made her living in the past being a spirit medium, married an alcoholic at age 14, divorced him, married again to a different man, and lived under the same roof as her ex, new husband, and children. She was a spiritualist who advocated for free love or expression of women's sexuality. After essentially swindling Cornelius Vanderbilt by communicating with his dead wife, he set them up with a Wall Street brokerage firm, they being Tennessee, her sister, and Victoria, and they began to publish Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, which sought social transformation, free love, women's suffrage and rights, spiritualism, radical labor politics, and communism. She aired out the sexual double standard of men, which later she exposed the affair between Henry Ward Beecher and Elizabeth Tilton, but we'll talk about that later. Even though she was new to the women's suffrage movement, she helped to redefine it. In her speech to the House Judiciary Committee, she reinterpreted the 14th and 15th Amendments, where she insisted that the rights and protections contained within those amendments also apply to women. The text quotes, "A race comprises all the people, male and female." Unlike the new departure activists whom she did help promote, Woodhull emphasized federal legislative action. She stepped into the National Association after being invited in by Anthony Stanton and others, where she began to be known as the leader of the party. And while Anthony was impressed by Woodhull's strategic methods, Stanton was more impressed by her breadth of vision. Within the year, however, Woodhull moved her focus to a new reform coalition that she would rename People's Convention, and took Hooker and Stanton with her, leaving Anthony alone in the minority. We see the dissociation between Anthony and Stanton following the People's Convention. Anthony took back control of the Unions Association and keenly focused on women's suffrage, as opposed to blending it with other agendas like Woodhull and Stanton had wanted. But now she was leading a much smaller organization, as most of the original group had left to join Woodhull and Stanton. Anthony later casted her vote for the 1872 election, which she was then arrested for by U.S. Marshals. She spent the months leading up to her trial lecturing and posing the question to the American audience, is it a crime for a U.S. citizen to vote? With the revitalization and reprinting of the 1848 Seneca Falls reports, Anthony and the other now reunited leaders of the suffrage movement made the myth come alive. They commemorated the 25th anniversary of the convention and embraced and emphasized a dialogue that excluded Stone and the other veterans, but used it to proclaim themselves as the movement's legitimate leaders. To have been at the Seneca Falls convention or to have joined the struggle that originated from there was to be on the right side of history. Yet only Stanton, between the pair of them, had actually attended. So Stone and the other activists who had played roles in the antebellum movement were erased from the dialogue simply because they hadn't been present at Seneca Falls. Anthony rewrote history in a sense and took place as the torch carrier for the movement. And her speech at the commemoration event boosts this impression. However, her loss in court and her fellow activist convictions dealt a severe blow to women's rights. And thus, Anthony, at the end, was forced back to advocating in a sea of grassroots, uncontrollable worlds of local activism, which she hated and lamented because she was being pushed by other activists. It's, I think, very important to note that Anthony Stanton's activism was clever and effective, but when the freedom and the power that women felt after the war had taken front center, I think their strategies became outdated and perhaps too slow for the voracious newcomers of activists. And I thought it was really interesting because in history overall, we really see Anthony as painted in sort of the saintly manner, where she is sort of the godmother of the suffrage movement. But the writer portrays Anthony in more of a critical, perhaps more negative light. The writer notes that Anthony felt eclipsed and rudderless by the new activists who were beginning to be recognized and lauded for their efforts. And she was left in the shadows of it. And I realize here that suffragists were so multifaceted and can't be put into one umbrella. And this is where I connect and highlight the theory of intersectionality, because there are so many intersections of identity that had been really brought to light by the court rulings talked about in the text, but also just overall in the movement history. I have 13 minutes. How do groups gain political power? By what we saw here in this text, the different women's suffrage organizations maintained their power by essentially stomping on each other, and it was really based on who had the loudest voice. Obviously, there were a lot of criticisms about who had the right to have that larger leadership voice, but overall, Woodhull really took power because she was so eccentric. She had such a fresh take on women's rights. And I think that here, going back to this idea of intersectionality, the suffrage movement really, or this text sort of glosses over the different identities that are felt by many people. It glossed over the class identity. It didn't really talk too much about the racial identity either. And so for me, this text, this is me being critical, but this text did highlight sort of the journey to post-war suffrage movement, but it really left out a lot of pieces that I think would have really enriched the text overall.